There is a teaching in the oldest Buddhist texts that treats human suffering with the precision a doctor applies to an illness, naming the mechanism, identifying the cause, describing the cure. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha organized this teaching into 4 parts. The first named what is actually happening when life feels the way it often feels. The second identified the cause. The third confirmed that the cause can cease. The fourth described a path, 8 specific practices, each one cultivated the way a farmer cultivates a field. This video follows those 4 parts through 6 lives, drawn from those same texts. A woman whose grief drove her to madness, and what the teaching gave her when everything else was gone. A king buried to his neck in a charnel ground who maintained, in that exact darkness, a quality of mind his captors had no means of reaching. A farmer who stood in his own field and recognized the entire path in the language he had worked in his whole life. A wandering stranger who spent years walking toward a teaching he couldn't name and found it in a potter's house on an otherwise ordinary evening. By the time this ends, all 4 parts will be clear, applicable to the particular shape of your particular life, starting from exactly where you are. Find a comfortable position wherever you are, and let this be slow. The teaching carries no urgency at all. It has been here a very long time. The first part of the teaching begins with a woman who did not know she was wandering. Her name was Vasitthi. She appears in the oldest recorded collection of women's Buddhist poetry from the Pali Canon, a collection of verses composed by women who had practiced and, in the tradition's understanding, had understood the teaching well enough to articulate it. Her account is among the most unsparing in the entire collection. She writes with the clarity that comes from having looked at what happened directly, without turning away from any part of it. Before the wandering, there was a household. There was a yard with specific morning sounds. There was grain to grind before the family woke, water to carry, clay pots that needed to be filled in a particular order each morning, because the order had become the shape of the morning itself. There were children, the weight of them, when they were carried, the specific warm heaviness of a sleeping body lifted from a mat on the floor, the way a small arm goes completely loose when sleep has finally deepened past the point of dreaming. Her hands knew all of this without being asked. The knowing lived in the hands themselves, in the angle of the wrist when lifting, in the pressure of the fingers when the work required pressure, in the automatic reaching that happened before the mind had caught up with what the body was already doing. For years, those hands had a purpose that never needed to be explained or justified, because the purpose was simply there, waking with the sun, present through all the hours between rising and sleep. There was the specific texture of raising children across the years, the way they went from being carried to walking beside her, from needing everything to needing different things, from one form of dependence to the next. Each year, the household rearranged itself around where they were. The food changed as their appetites changed. The sounds in the yard changed as the games changed. The evenings changed as conversations became possible that had not been possible before. A household with children in it is a living thing, something that continuously adjusts to the particular shape of the lives being lived inside it. And the woman at the center of all that adjusting adjusts with it, so gradually and so completely that she becomes, without noticing, a person whose entire inner organization has grown around the children's presence. These are the kinds of changes a person does not notice while they are inside them, because the person is too occupied with the actual living to step outside and observe the shape of the life being built. The shape only becomes visible from outside, and she was about to be outside it. Then one child died, then another, then the youngest. Vasithi's poem does not describe the manner of each death. What it describes is what the losses produced inside her, and what they produced was grief in a form she could neither hold nor name. The coherence of her inner life dissolved the way a structure dissolves when the thing holding it together is suddenly and completely gone. She wandered. She moved through roads and fields and towns for weeks without knowing she was moving. She did not choose a direction. She did not register hunger or cold. She did not notice that her clothing had come undone, or that people moved out of her path as she came near them, or that days were passing around her like weather she was no longer part of. The mind that organizes itself entirely around certain presences, the morning voice of a child, the weight of a body held against the chest, the daily rhythm of care for lives that depend on that care, loses its organizing center when those presences are gone. What remains keeps moving, keeps reaching, keeps searching the space where the presence used to be, because searching was what the life required, and the life has ended, but the searching has not received the instruction to stop. The wandering was coherent in exactly this sense, a mind continuing to do what it had been built to do, in conditions where what it had been built for was no longer there to be found. She moved through the responses of the people she passed without registering them. Some were afraid. Some mocked her. The fear and the mockery came from the same place. A person whose grief had exceeded the ordinary social container was asking something of those who witnessed her that most of them had no means of giving. The ordinary social responses to visible suffering, comfort, advice, the suggestion that things would improve, were not adequate to what she was carrying, and most people, sensing this gap, moved away from it rather than toward it. She kept moving. She came eventually to the area near Mithila where the Buddha was teaching. The meeting the text's record is quiet. A woman who had been wandering for weeks came into the presence of a man who looked at what was in front of him without looking away from it. Every other person whose path had crossed hers in that time had managed their own discomfort with what she was carrying by moving past it, around it, or away from it. The Buddha looked at her the way a physician looks at a patient who has traveled a long distance to be seen, with full attention, without needing the person in front of him to be less ill than she was. There is something that happens when a person in extreme distress encounters that quality of steady attention. The Therigatha does not analyze it, but records the effect. She stopped. She sat. After weeks of roads and distances and people moving away from her, she came into contact with something that did not move away, and something in her recognized that this was what the searching had been unable to find in any town or on any road. He spoke to her. He offered no reassurance about where her children had gone. He did not suggest that suffering held a hidden meaning visible from a wider perspective. What he said, as the texts record it, is this: she had loved, she had lost, and loss is the nature of all things that come into being through causes. Every composite thing, everything that comes into existence through the meeting of conditions, will, when those conditions change with them. The children were composite things. Their arising was real. Their ceasing was real. Both belonged to the same truth. And the reaching, the weeks of roads searching for what the hands had held, could change nothing of what was already unchangeable. Impermanence. Every school of Buddhism across 2,500 years has returned to this word, because it sits at the center of what the teaching is attempting to address. Impermanence here carries no consolation inside it. It is the structural fact of conditioned existence, stated plainly as a description of how things actually are. To soften it would be to falsify it. What the Buddha offered Vasitthi on that road was accuracy, and accuracy, in the Buddhist understanding, is the form care takes when comfort would require saying something less than true. The physician who names a condition clearly does not cause harm by naming it. The naming is the beginning of knowing what to do. Something shifted in Vasitthi. The texts describe it as a return, the specific quality of a mind gathering itself back into coherence after having been scattered across weeks of roads. The grief was still completely present. What stopped was the particular quality of not knowing where to go that had been driving the movement, the directionless searching that had continued, because it had not been given a clear account of what it was doing and why it could not find what it was looking for. She listened, and over the following days, received the teaching in full. The grieving did not lift on any particular morning. What the canon records is a gradual process, a mind beginning to understand the mechanism of its own suffering, which is itself the first change the teaching produces. Understanding the mechanism does not immediately dissolve the feeling. It ends the confusion around the feeling, and ending the confusion changes what the feeling does inside a life. She requested ordination and practiced seriously over the years before composing the verses that bear her name. The poem does not beautify what happened. The children died, the madness came, she wandered, stated without apology, without framing that would make these facts easier to receive. The closing lines describe her mind as concentrated, freed, and clear. She says she has understood what needs to be understood. She is reporting a fundamental change in how experience was being met, a transformation in the relationship to circumstances that had not themselves changed. The children were still gone. The years without them were still the texture of her daily life. What had changed was the second layer, the mind's constant searching for what was no longer present to be found, the inability to let the grief be what it was, without simultaneously battling the fact that it existed. When that searching eased through understanding the mechanism of the reaching, rather than through suppression or forgetting, what remained was grief without the additional weight of fighting it. Grief that is met directly has somewhere to go. Grief with resistance layered through it keeps circling. The energy that might have allowed the feeling to move through and complete itself is instead consumed in fighting the fact that the feeling exists. Now the teaching itself can be named. The Buddha organized suffering into 3 distinct forms. Once heard, these 3 forms become recognizable in any ordinary week, in any life. The first is the most obvious: plain pain, grief, illness, loss, the specific ache of something ending without warning, the weight of a conversation that leaves a residue lasting for days. This form announces itself without ambiguity. It arrived for Vasitthi in a sequence that left no room for adjustment. For most people, it arrives in smaller doses, spread across the years, but the quality is the same. Something that was present is no longer present, and the fact of its absence cannot be argued with. The second form lives inside pleasant experience as much as painful experience. You are sitting at a table with people you love, and somewhere in the quality of that evening is the awareness that it is already becoming the past, that these people will change, that this hour will not come again in exactly this form. The pleasure is real. The awareness of impermanence riding alongside it is also real. Both occupy the same moment. Every parent who has watched a child sleep has felt this. The love is complete, and somewhere inside that completeness is the knowledge that the child in front of you tonight will not be exactly this child tomorrow. The years pass as they are being lived, and the living and the passing are simultaneous. Every good thing already contains the seed of its own change, and we know this even as we love the good thing fully. The third form is the most pervasive and the hardest to point at directly because it operates below the level of specific experience. It is the quiet, structural sense that the present moment is not quite complete as it is, that something is still slightly out of reach, that fullness keeps arriving at a delay, that the current arrangement of things does not satisfy in the way it was supposed to. It is the specific restlessness that makes a pleasant afternoon feel slightly hollow, that keeps the mind scanning the horizon for something it cannot quite name, but remains convinced is slightly ahead of where it currently is. This is the grinding quality built into the wheel, persistent, low level, following a person through circumstances that, from the outside, look entirely fine. All 3 were present in Vasithi's wandering: the plain pain of the losses, the impermanence that every parent carries alongside every moment of care, and beneath both, the reaching, the mind moving through roads and fields, in search of what it had been organized around. The wandering was the perfectly coherent response of a mind that had lost what it had been coherent around, and what the teaching addressed was the specific mechanism generating the wandering, the reaching itself, the engine that the grief had set in motion. The first part of the Buddha's teaching says plainly, "This is real." The unsatisfactoriness belongs to the structure of a life that depends on conditions for its continuity in a world where conditions are always changing. The person who feels it is paying accurate attention to what is actually here. The teaching begins with this observation as an act of recognition, a way of saying, you are reading the situation correctly. What you do with that accurate reading is what the rest of the teaching addresses. Most of us have spent years working around this ache, finding the right distraction, the right reframe, the right story about what is happening that makes the feeling more manageable. A mind encountering discomfort tends to move away from it, reduce it, keep functioning. The first part of the teaching does not judge this response. It shows what it costs. A mind actively keeping the ache at a manageable distance is consuming a significant portion of itself in that management, less available for full presence in the moments that actually matter, for genuine contact with the people in front of it, for the quality of attention that allows ordinary experience to be fully lived rather than observed from behind a careful distance. The management takes many forms. The phone checked between thoughts, the evening planned so densely that nothing can get in, the busyness that feels productive, but is partly the specific busyness of a person keeping something from becoming audible. Left unmet, the ache also does not diminish on its own. It continues in the background, the tightness in the chest in the early hours of the morning, the flatness that settles over an otherwise pleasant afternoon without clear cause, the sense that something is not quite right that persists through circumstances that, from the outside, look entirely fine. The management requires constant maintenance, and the cost of that maintenance compounds across years. The teaching asks for accurate looking. There is a specific quality of relief that comes from naming precisely what is actually present. A person given a precise account of a long-standing condition experiences a particular easing, not because the condition has resolved, but because the confusion around it has. The confusion is its own weight. It sits on top of the actual suffering and makes the actual suffering harder to meet directly, harder to work with. Removing the confusion does not remove the suffering. It makes the suffering workable. And workable is where everything else in this teaching begins. What working with the first part of the teaching actually looks like in a life is worth being specific about. Looking directly at suffering means recognizing its form accurately. This is grief. This is the awareness of impermanence. This is the structural restlessness of a mind encountering the nature of conditioned experience. That recognition is quieter than it sounds. It is the difference between being inside the grief and the story about the grief simultaneously, and being inside the grief while the story slows down enough to stop generating its own additional suffering. The story, the version of events the mind keeps narrating, explaining, building the case for, adds its own weight to what is already heavy. A story about grief can insist that the grief means something permanent about the future, or about the reliability of love, or about the person's capacity to survive what they are currently surviving. The grief itself carries none of those insistences. Seeing the story as a story does not eliminate the grief. It stops the story from multiplying the grief. Vasitthi did not arrive at clarity by working harder at her grief. She arrived at it by understanding what the grief was doing and what she had been adding to it, the layer of resistance, the searching for what could not be found, the motion that continued because the life had trained her for motion, and the life's organizing purpose was gone. Understanding what is happening is always prior to knowing what to do about it. That sequence is built into the structure of the teaching itself. First, see accurately, then understand the cause, then recognize that the cause can cease, then walk the path. The first step, seeing accurately, is where everyone begins, regardless of how much or how little practice they have done. The particular thing the first part of the teaching offers, what Vasitthi received on that road and carried into the years of practice that followed, is permission. Permission to let what is difficult be difficult, without adding to the difficulty the weight of fighting the fact that it is difficult at all. This is smaller than it sounds, and also larger than it sounds. Smaller, because it asks nothing dramatic, no heroic facing down, no forced gratitude, no insistence on finding the lesson before the feeling has had time to complete itself. Larger, because the permission, once genuinely received, changes the relationship to everything the teaching addresses afterward. You cannot work clearly with a cause you have not accurately identified. You cannot understand cessation without having first seen what it is that would cease. The first part of the teaching is the ground everything else stands on. Vasithi's poem has been in the canon for more than 2,000 years. It has been read by people in grief across every century since it was composed, in languages she would not have recognized, in circumstances she could not have imagined. It remains because it describes grief accurately, and accurate description, in the Buddhist understanding, is itself a form of care. The poem does not tell the reader what to feel. It shows what one woman felt, exactly as she felt it, and what became possible once the feeling was seen clearly. That is the entire movement of the first part of the teaching, compressed into the arc of one life. The second part begins with the cause. It asks a question simple to state and genuinely difficult to sit with. What is the mind reaching for, specifically when it reaches? And where does that reaching live in the relationships we are actually inside, in the love we are actually offering and receiving, in the choices that feel so much like simply being who we are, that they barely register as choices at all? The first part of the teaching named what is present. The second part looks underneath what is present and identifies the mechanism generating it, the specific quality of craving that the teaching calls thirst, the mind's constant movement toward what it wants and away from what it doesn't want, even when that movement is itself producing the suffering. A Brahmin named Markandeya tried to give the Buddha his daughter. In the refusal and its long aftermath, the second part of the teaching arrived with a clarity that took years to complete. Markandeya was a Brahmin of standing in the town of Kammasadhamma, and he had a daughter whose beauty had been remarked upon across the region for years. He had refused many offers for her. This refusal came from a conviction he had carried quietly. The person who would be worthy of her had not yet appeared. The refusals were, in their way, a form of love. He believed something adequate to what his daughter was would eventually present itself, and he was prepared to wait. One morning, walking outside the town, he saw the Buddha seated at the edge of a path. What he saw in the man's bearing stopped him. There was a quality of absolute stillness in how the man sat, the specific stillness of someone who had arrived somewhere and had no need to be elsewhere. Something in Markandeya recognized this quality as the thing he had been holding the space for. He turned and walked back to his house immediately. He returned with his wife and his daughter. He introduced them with the warmth of a man delivering something he has held in careful trust for a long time to the person it was always intended for. He made his offer with a full and completely sincere heart. The Buddha looked at the daughter without desire. He then spoke about what the mind does with beauty. When it encounters it, it reaches. He described 3 forms of this reaching: toward pleasure, toward the continuation of what is pleasant, away from what is unpleasant. He said that satisfying these forms of reaching does not end them. It satisfies this instance. The reaching itself persists and will arise again in the same form or another. And then he offered a simile that Markandeya found deeply, viscerally offensive. He described a leper, a man whose wounds had gone open across his body, the skin broken, the flesh beneath exposed. This man sits at the edge of a fire pit. He thrusts his open wounds toward the heat and scratches them at the same time. The heat brings a specific kind of relief. Warmth on raw skin produces a sensation that interrupts the itch for as long as the heat is present. The scratching intensifies this relief momentarily, but the scratching deepens the wound. The relief depends on the wound remaining a wound. Move the leper away from the fire, clean the wounds, and treat them properly, and the relief produced by the heat becomes unnecessary because the condition requiring it has been addressed at its root. But the leper at the fire would resist being moved. The relief feels real. The alternative feels like deprivation. This, the Buddha said, is what craving does. It provides relief of a kind that maintains the wound requiring relief. Each satisfaction produces the next wanting. The sequence never completes itself because the mechanism was not designed to complete, it was designed to continue. A person embedded in this mechanism offered the possibility of a different relationship to experience, will receive that offer the way the leper receives being moved from the fire, as a loss, as deprivation, as something to resist. Markandeya left in anger. His daughter was not named in the simile, but the implication had landed with full force. He had offered something he valued completely and received in return a teaching about the nature of valuing itself. His anger was the entirely predictable response of a mind that craving was protecting from a teaching about craving. The texts record what followed across the years. His daughter, whose name was Markandeya, eventually became one of the wives of King Udana of Kosambi. She was beautiful and intelligent, raised by a father whose years of careful refusal had communicated, clearly and repeatedly, that she was something exceptional, deserving the best the world could offer. She arrived at the king's court carrying this understanding of herself, and she was not wrong about the specific facts of it. She was exceptional. The king prized her. She had standing, comfort, and the king's attention. By every external measurement available in her world, she had what she had been raised to believe she deserved. And it was not enough. The king had other wives, and the other wives diminished her in her own understanding, from the center of everything to one among several. She was given the best the king's court could provide: fine rooms, attendants, clothing, food, and the genuine regard of a man of power. Each of these was real. Each provided the kind of relief the fire always provides. And the relief, in every case, required the wanting to remain active in order to be felt as relief at all. A person who no longer wanted the king's favor would not experience his favor as a gift. The pleasure of possession depends on the existence of the craving for possession, and the craving, once fed, simply takes a new form. What she wanted now was not merely the favor, but the exclusivity of the favor. What she wanted was to be the only one, and that wanting could not be satisfied without generating the next, sharper version of itself. She used her position. She arranged for people in the streets of Kosambi to abuse the Buddha as he walked through the town, calling after him, insulting him publicly, creating an atmosphere of hostility around him wherever he went. This is recorded in the Dhammapada commentary as a consequence of the long arc that began the morning her father made his offer. The anger Markandeya carried from that morning had moved through the years and had settled in his daughter as a specific quality of resentment toward the man who had refused what her father offered. She could not have articulated this connection. The link between her father's wounded pride and her own actions years later was not visible to her as a link. This is one of the ways the teaching on craving is most precise. The mechanism operates largely below the level of conscious awareness, shaping choices that feel like free decisions, while being thoroughly conditioned by what the craving has been doing across years of a life. The harassment continued for a time. The Buddha's disciples were distressed by it, and he responded by walking them through a sequence of questions that led them to see that adding their own agitation to the agitation around them compounds, rather than reduces it. But the more significant moment in this longer arc belongs to Markandeya herself. She was eventually brought, through events the texts do not detail, into a genuine encounter with the teaching she had spent years opposing. What this encounter required of her was the willingness to hear what the teaching actually said, rather than to continue hearing what she had long decided it had done to her family. She had spent years living the illustration the Buddha had given her father. She had sat at the fire pit, and the fire had brought the kind of relief the fire always brings, temporary, dependent on the wound remaining open, requiring constant renewal. The king's favor was real. The comfort it provided was real. What it could not provide was the cessation of the wanting, because no external arrangement has ever been capable of providing that. She had been given persuasive reasons to believe otherwise, and the years had quietly demonstrated the limits of those reasons. Now the teaching itself can be named. The second part of the Buddha's teaching identifies the cause of the suffering described in the first part. The cause is craving. The specific quality of reaching the teaching calls thirst. The word thirst is precise in a way that desire or wanting are not. Thirst is the experience of genuine need, driven toward finding relief by a discomfort that sharpens the longer it goes unaddressed. Satisfying thirst does not end the capacity for thirst. It ends this instance. Tomorrow the thirst returns. The teaching uses this word because it names the quality accurately. The reaching is driven by an absence, not simply inclined towards something pleasant. There is urgency in it. There is the quality of something that cannot simply wait. The teaching identifies three forms of this craving, and once heard, all three become recognizable in any ordinary week. The first is craving for sensory pleasure, the reaching toward taste, touch, sound, sight, or thought that promises relief from discomfort or an intensification of what is already pleasant. The phone checked when the mind grows restless. The food reached for when something uncomfortable circles nearby. The distraction chosen when the present moment feels insufficient. The conversation extended past the point of genuine interest because the silence that would follow feels harder than the talking. Each of these satisfies something genuine. Briefly, the mechanism that generated the reaching is not touched by the satisfaction. It generates the next reaching. The second is craving for continuation, wanting things to remain exactly as they are when they are going well, wanting the relationship to stay as it currently is, wanting the good period at work to extend indefinitely, wanting the child who is currently easy to be with to remain easy to be with in the same ways next year and the year after that. This form attaches itself to good experience and turns what might have been fully received into something that must be maintained and defended against change. The good thing stops being something fully enjoyed and becomes something continuously threatened. A quality of vigilance settles inside pleasant experience, and the vigilance takes up the space that the experience itself might otherwise have occupied. The third form is craving for cessation, for something to stop, for the difficult feeling to end, for the uncomfortable situation to resolve, for escape from the present arrangement of things. This form is easy to miss because it sounds like reasonable preference. Wanting suffering to end sounds correct, and the third part of the teaching does say that suffering can cease. The distinction the teaching draws is between the cessation of the craving that generates suffering and the escape from suffering while leaving the craving intact. One addresses the root, the other manages a symptom while leaving the condition in place. Gandhi's life illustrated all three: the reaching for what the king's favor could provide, the demand that the favor be exclusive and unchanging, and beneath both, the craving for the ache of never quite being enough, of having something she deserved, refused from the very beginning, to simply stop. The harassment of the Buddha in Kosambi was, at its root, that third form, the attempt to make the source of a long-standing discomfort disappear from the landscape of her life entirely. It produced nothing of the kind. The discomfort was not located in the Buddha. It was located in the mechanism itself, and that mechanism traveled with her wherever she went. The teaching on craving is the most difficult of the 4 parts to receive, and the difficulty is worth being specific about. The difficulty is not philosophical. It comes from the fact that this part of the teaching locates the cause of suffering inside the very process the mind is most invested in continuing. A mind organized around certain forms of craving will experience the teaching about craving as a direct address to the organizing principle of the life itself. This is what Magandia experienced on the road. The refusal and its accompanying teaching did not touch something peripheral. They addressed what was most central to his sense of himself: a man of discernment, a good father, a person whose capacity to recognize quality had finally found its proper object. The anger was evidence of the teaching's accuracy. The more centrally craving is organized into a life, the more resistant the mind is to hearing what the teaching says about it. A person embedded in a way of organizing their life around wanting does not experience that organizing as craving. They experience it as love, as ambition, as the appropriate care for what matters to them, as the reasonable preference for things going well. The teaching asks for a quality of attention precise enough to notice the reaching underneath these experiences, the grasping inside the love, the resistance to change, sitting inside every strong attachment to what is currently good. The leper simile is the teaching's most direct image because it acknowledges that pleasure is real. The heat is genuinely warm. The relief is genuinely felt. What the simile shows is that this particular structure of relief requires the wound to remain a wound, that seeking comfort in a way that depends on remaining in a state of needing comfort will never address the underlying condition. The fire is not the problem. The wound is, and the leper at the fire offered the possibility of treating the wound rather than managing its effects, resists, because from inside the reaching, the relief feels indistinguishable from the solution. This structure is present in most of what fills an ordinary day. The specific arrangement of activities, relationships, and ambitions that constitutes a life is partly the architecture of a person's particular craving. the forms the reaching has taken in one life, shaped by what that life has rewarded and what it has withheld. The content differs from person to person. The structure beneath the content does not. Something is wanted. The wanting drives movement toward it. The getting provides brief relief. The relief passes. The wanting returns, slightly shaped by what the getting produced. The movement resumes. Most people living inside this structure do not experience it as a structure. They experience it as simply how things are, the natural texture of a life being lived in the ordinary way. The reaching is so familiar that it generates no friction. It becomes legible only when something disrupts the cycle, when a long-wanted thing is finally obtained and the relief it provides is shorter than expected, when a relationship that was supposed to resolve something leaves an ache the relationship cannot address, when a life that meets every external criterion still feels insufficient in ways the person cannot fully explain. At these moments, the structure becomes briefly visible. Most people respond by adjusting the wanting something slightly different, or more of what they currently have. The adjustment keeps the structure intact. The teaching asks for the specific act of looking at the structure itself, noticing the reaching as reaching, the grasping as grasping, the quality of thirst operating underneath what the mind calls love or preference, or the reasonable desire for things to go well. This noticing does not require dramatic renunciation or the abandonment of what matters. It requires the kind of attention that can distinguish between the person loved and the craving for that person to remain exactly as they are, between the work that genuinely matters and the craving for that work to be recognized in specific ways, between the life being lived and the persistent insistence that the life be slightly other than it currently is. The value in the second part of the teaching is worth naming directly. The cause of suffering has been located inside a process that is observable. What can be observed can be worked with. The cause is not located in circumstances, in the wrong relationship, or the arrangement of things that must change before relief becomes possible. It is located in the quality of the reaching itself, which means the path towards cessation does not wait for the circumstances to improve. It requires understanding to deepen, and that deepening remains available regardless of what the circumstances happen to be doing. Markandeya's anger on the road was not the anger of a bad man. It was the anger of a man in whom craving was operating completely enough that a teaching about craving produced, on first contact, exactly the resistance the teaching had described. He was inside the mechanism while hearing a description of it. Most people are. What the second part of the teaching offers is not an immediate exit from the mechanism, but a beginning of seeing it clearly, noticing the reaching as reaching in this conversation, in this moment of wanting something to be different, in this quiet scanning of the horizon for what is just slightly ahead of where things currently are. The noticing creates a gap. The gap is small, and the gap is everything the third part of the teaching works with. A king was buried to his neck in a charnel ground. His captors had removed his kingdom, his freedom of movement, and everything the world uses to measure whether a life is going well. What they found when they returned, what had persisted through the darkness, the cold, and the smell of death around him, is the third part of the teaching given its most complete and unsparing demonstration. Before the charnel ground, there was a kingdom. It had been functioning well for years, and Mahāsīlava's governance was the reason. He administered it with a particular quality of care. He held ministers accountable, directed the treasury toward his people's welfare, and made decisions that required absorbing political difficulty rather than choosing the convenient path. He was not a figure of legend in the way that legend tends to idealize its subjects. He was a man who tried consistently across years to do what governing well requires, in a world where doing what governing well requires always has costs. The people under his governance knew this about him, not through formal announcement, but through the accumulation of small decisions across years. A court case decided in favor of the person without standing rather than the person with influence. A public project funded from the treasury that served those who could not petition for it themselves. The quality of a ruler who has decided that governance is something done for others rather than something done for oneself shows up, over time, in the texture of ordinary life. The texture of life in Mahāsīlava's kingdom reflected this. The ministers he eventually dismissed had been taking bribes. He examined the evidence carefully, gave the process the time it required, and expelled them from their positions when the evidence was clear. It was the correct decision. It was also the decision that unraveled everything he had built. The expelled ministers traveled to the king of a neighboring territory and offered him something of precise value, detailed knowledge of Mahāsīlava's court, its defenses, its rhythms, the specific vulnerabilities in its structure. They had this knowledge because they had served closely for years. They spent it without hesitation. The neighboring king listened, understood what was being handed to him, and moved his army. The conquest was swift. Mahāsīlava was captured and brought before the conquering king. He arrived without the resources that make defeat bearable. No standing, no leverage, no allies within reach. The conquering king assessed him with the eyes of someone calculating what use a defeated ruler still serves, and arrived at a decision more elaborate than execution. Mahāsīlava was taken to the royal charnel ground, the place outside the city walls where the dead were left to decompose, and buried upright in the earth, to the neck. The soil was packed around him to the level of his shoulders. His head remained above the surface. He was left there as the light drained from the sky. The charnel ground outside an ancient Indian city was a place of active decomposition, the smell of organic matter returning to soil, the sounds of animals that moved through it after dark, because the dark offered what they needed. Jackals came regularly. Wild dogs came. The smell was constant and did not vary with the time of night or the season. For a man buried to his neck in such a place, unable to move any part of his body except his head, with darkness settling around him and the sounds of what was approaching from every direction. The hours ahead were a confrontation with the most fundamental human fears, delivered in their most complete form. What the texts record he did in those conditions is worth receiving slowly. He entered into the practice of loving kindness, the deliberate cultivation of goodwill, extended outward toward all living beings, beginning with himself, then to those nearby, then to strangers, then to those who had caused him harm, and finally, without limit or exception, to all beings in every direction. This practice is usually described in conditions of voluntary stillness: a quiet room, the floor of a forest monastery, a meditation hall. Mahāsīlava practiced it buried to his neck in a charnel ground. He extended that goodwill to the ministers who had brought about his capture, to the king who had ordered this, to the jackals moving through the darkness, outside and around him. Loving kindness in the Buddhist understanding is not a performance of warmth toward people who have done real harm. It is the specific orientation of a mind that has released its grip on wanting harm to come to those who caused harm. It does not revise the facts. Mahāsīlava's kingdom had been taken through betrayal. This remained entirely true, and the practice did not require pretending otherwise. What it addressed was the mind's habitual response to those facts, the compulsive activity that constructs resentment, rehearses grievances, generates images of what justice would require, and consumes attention in interior work that cannot change anything already occurred. When the practice is genuine, that activity quiets through a reorientation of where attention rests, rather than through suppression. The night moved forward around him. The sounds came closer, and then receded, and then came close again. What the nature of the practice implies, though the texts do not narrate his internal experience, is that the hours were spent in sustained, active, interior work, the mind fully occupied with the direction it had chosen, rather than with what the situation would ordinarily generate. Extending genuine goodwill to the ministers required holding them in mind as beings who had acted from fear, from wounded pride, from the ordinary human calculation of self-interest, beings capable of harm precisely because they were caught in the same mechanism of craving and self-protection that produces harm in any life. This is what the practice is for. Releasing the grip that keeps the mind locked onto what it has decided is responsible for its suffering, and returning attention to what is actually present in this moment, in this circumstance, with this darkness and these sounds and this particular patch of sky visible above. The fear was real. There is no version of a charnel ground at night that does not include fear, and the texts do not claim that Mahāsīlava was untouched by it. What the practice offered was a specific relationship to the fear, meeting it as one more condition present in this moment, rather than as a signal requiring immediate escape from what generated it. The difference between these two relationships to fear is practically significant. A mind that fear drives cannot use its attention for anything other than managing the fear and scanning for additional threats. A mind through which fear passes remains available to what else is present: the ground beneath him, the patch of sky visible above, and eventually, in the deep hours of the night, the sound, and then the proximity of a jackal coming close. At some point in the darkness, that jackal approached him. This is not a symbolic detail inserted by later tradition. Jackals came to charnel grounds because charnel grounds contained food, and a man buried upright in the earth was a presence that would attract investigation. The jackal came close and sniffed at his face. Mahāsīlava, in a condition of attention sustained through hours of practice, turned his head slowly and closed his teeth gently on the jackal's ear. The jackal pulled sharply back. In pulling, it disturbed the earth packed around the king's head. The disturbance was small, a loosening in the compacted soil at the surface around his neck. Over the hours that followed, Mahāsīlava worked this loosening with the only part of him that could move: his head, his neck. The soil worked slowly and without the kind of urgency that would pack it tighter, gradually gave way. The night was long enough for what the process required. Before the sky began to lighten, he had freed himself from the earth. He did not move toward escape. When he emerged, he walked to the palace. When the conquering king was told that his prisoner was at the gate requesting an audience, he agreed to see him out of a curiosity that had no ready framework for what was being described. Mahāsīlava entered and stood before the man who had ordered him buried. He did not carry grievance in his bearing, or the particular quality of a man arriving to settle a score. He offered a teaching about governance, that a kingdom built on betrayal will be betrayed in turn, that the ministers who brought intelligence against one king will carry it against another, that stable rule has its foundation in the quality of what a ruler does with power rather than in its accumulation. The conquering king listened carefully. What was in front of him was a man who had spent a night in a charnel ground and arrived at the palace the following morning, carrying neither bitterness nor urgency, only what was true, offered plainly, without the quality of someone expecting anything in return. He was persuaded in the way a person is persuaded when they encounter something solid, through the quality of what was in front of him rather than through the force of the argument. Mahāsīlava was restored to his throne. The restoration is not the center of what this story carries. Had Mahāsīlava been killed at the gate, the third part of the teaching would have been no less demonstrated by the night he spent in the charnel ground. Cessation is not defined by what circumstances produce afterward. It is defined by what the mind does with what is present now. The restoration shows what becomes possible when a person operates from that quality of mind. The night in the charnel ground shows what the quality itself actually is. Now the third part of the teaching can be named. The third part says that suffering can cease. This claim requires care in the receiving, because what it means and what it sounds like are genuinely different. It does not mean that painful circumstances will be removed from a well-practiced life, or that equanimity produces pleasant feeling in difficult situations. What it says is more specific. The particular suffering generated by craving, the compulsive adding that turns plain pain into something consuming and relentless, can be addressed at its root. And when it is addressed at its root, what remains is experience without that specific quality of addition. The charnel ground is still a charnel ground. The loss of the kingdom is still entirely real. What ceases is the mind's automatic movement toward elaborating what is already there. The word equanimity is worth examining directly because it is consistently misread. It sounds like emotional flatness, the quality of a person who has stopped being affected by things. What the tradition means by it is the quality of a mind that meets experience fully, without the compulsion to immediately make that experience different from what it is. A person with this quality feels the cold. They hear the jackals. They know their situation with complete accuracy. What they do not have is the automatic machinery of thoughts about how the situation ought to be otherwise, who is to blame for it being this way, and what would constitute adequate redress. Mahāsīlava in the charnel ground had the full weight of the first kind of experience. The second kind was largely absent. The absence of the second kind is what the word cessation actually names. This distinction shows up in ordinary life in forms far smaller than a charnel ground, and the teaching intends for it to be recognized in those smaller forms. Consider the experience of making an error at work, something missed, something said badly in a meeting in front of colleagues. The plain experience is specific and immediate. The flush of embarrassment, the awareness of having failed at something in public, the knowledge that consequences follow. What ordinarily follows, so automatically that most people experience the whole sequence as a single unbroken event, is an extended interior narration. What this reveals about competence in general, whether it reflects inadequacies others have been noticing for longer than this particular moment, how far the consequences will extend. Each of these generates its own discomfort, which generates the next, and the embarrassment that lasted 3 minutes occupies the next 3 hours. The cessation the third part of the teaching points toward is the gradual development of enough space between the plain experience and the added narration that the narration can be seen as narration, a process the mind is doing, rather than a truth the situation contains. That space begins very small in early practice. It grows through the kind of steady, unglamorous attention that most practice actually consists of. As it grows, what a difficult moment does to the rest of the day begins to change. There is a specific quality of relief that develops as equanimity grows through ordinary practice, and it is worth naming directly. The relief arrives as the noticing, in a moment of difficulty, that the familiar spiral either did not begin or began and was seen before it had run its full course. This noticing, which feels small from inside it, represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between the mind and its own activity. The mind that notices the spiral starting can choose, in that moment of noticing, whether to follow it. The mind that does not notice cannot choose. Equanimity begins in the gap between the impulse and the action that follows from it, and it grows as that gap becomes more consistently available. Most people have experienced this in moments of genuine presence, a conversation in which they were fully absorbed, a task that held their attention so completely that the habitual mental machinery quieted on its own. The practice is the deliberate cultivation of that quality, rather than waiting for circumstances to produce it by accident. The third part of the teaching also carries something specific for the person currently inside a situation that cannot be changed. Some situations are simply what they are. Some losses are not recoverable. Some circumstances will not improve, regardless of what the person inside them does. For these situations, the third part of the teaching does not address the circumstances. It addresses what the mind does with the circumstances. In situations where the facts are fixed, changing what the mind does with those facts is the specific form of relief available. The suffering that belongs to the facts is what it is. The suffering that comes from the adding, the mind's constant movement of wanting the facts to be other than they are, the replaying and the wishing and the construction of a case against how things have turned out, can be worked with. The Buddhist teachings claim is that this second form of relief is the deepest relief available under any conditions, because it addresses the mechanism that generates suffering regardless of what external conditions happen to be doing. The third part requires a particular kind of courage to receive, and this is worth being honest about. The first part asked for honest acknowledgement of what is actually present. The second part asked for honest attention to the mechanism generating it. The third part asks for the willingness to trust that genuine change is possible, which means trusting something not yet fully experienced. For a person who has been carrying a familiar quality of suffering for years, this requires genuine openness, the actual willingness to entertain that the quality of experience can be different, rather than performed willingness that still expects to be disappointed. The familiar weight has become, over years, part of the texture of things. Its disappearance cannot be fully imagined from inside it. The teaching asks for trust in the direction before the destination is visible. Mahāsīlava's story is useful precisely here, because it shows where the quality that carried him through the charnel ground came from. The texts describe him as someone who had governed with genuine care across years, which means someone who had been practicing in the context of real decisions with real consequences, the specific orientation of a mind more interested in what is right than in what is comfortable or advantageous. The charnel ground was where that practice was tested in its most extreme form. It held because it had been built through such ordinary moments, the daily choice to absorb difficulty rather than take the convenient path, the consistent orientation of attention towards something other than its own protection and comfort. This is how equanimity develops in any life. It accumulates through small choices across ordinary days. The moment when the mind's first impulse toward defensiveness in a difficult conversation is noticed and not automatically followed. The moment when something goes wrong and the thought that wants to spiral into an extended story about what it means is seen as a thought rather than an accurate reading of the situation. These moments feel unremarkable when they occur. They generate no evidence visible from outside that anything of significance has happened. Their accumulated effect across months and years is what gets demonstrated when the charnel ground arrives, in whatever form it arrives. A common misreading of the third part of the teaching hears it as passive, as counsel toward accepting injustice without response. Mahāsīlava's behavior after his release addresses this directly. He did not disappear quietly. He walked back to the palace and offered a teaching that resulted in his reinstatement. The equanimity he demonstrated was the quality that made his action more precise and more effective. Action taken from rage tends to satisfy the emotional need of the person acting more reliably than it addresses the situation being acted upon. Action taken from clarity meets the situation as it actually is, with the full availability of attention, not consumed in the weather of craving and resentment. The third part has made its claim and offered its evidence. A claim with evidence is still not a practice. The question it generates, for anyone who has received it honestly, is the one Mahāsīlava's story makes inevitable. If cessation is genuinely possible, if equanimity is cultivated through ordinary moments, rather than arriving through dramatic spiritual attainment, if the adding that extends plain pain into something relentless is a process that can be worked with, then what does the working with actually consist of? What specific practices develop this quality? What does the path look like in the ordinary days where most practice either happens or does not happen? In conversations that go badly, in early mornings when the familiar restlessness arrives, in the daily work of moving through a life that contains, as every life contains, its full portion of difficulty. The answer the Buddha gave was specific and practical, organized into 8 areas of daily practice, each connected to the others, each one workable from the very first day of genuinely attempting it. A Brahmin named Kasi Bharadvaja was standing in his field one morning when a wandering man came and stood at the edge of his land, waiting for food. What passed between them that morning is the 4th part of the teaching given in the only form most people will ever need it. The language of work already being done, the soil already being turned, the harvest that a person who has spent their life cultivating things understands without needing to be told what cultivating means. The ploughing festival at Ekanar happened in the weeks before the monsoon, when the soil had softened enough to be worked and the rains were still a month away. 500 ploughs were in the field that morning, teams of animals moving along their furrows, workers following in rows behind them, the noise and smell of turned earth, thick in the air across the full width of the cultivated land, from its near boundary to where the tree line marked its far edge. Kasi Bharadvaja had farmed this land for years, and his movement through the morning's work carried the particular efficiency of someone whose body has absorbed the individual steps so completely that attention is freed for what only long experience can read. Which sections of the field need more depth today, where the soil is compacting and will need different treatment, how the angle of the light indicates how many hours remain before the heat becomes a limiting factor. He knew this land with the knowledge that accumulates through decades of working the same ground, a knowledge living below the level of conscious thought, expressing itself in the hands going to the right place before the mind has issued any instruction. The field and the man who farmed it had been in relationship long enough that the distinction between knowing the field and knowing himself had, in some practical sense, dissolved. He was also responsible, as host of the festival, for feeding 500 workers before the day's labor could properly begin. He moved among them, distributing food with the same efficiency he brought to everything the day required, when he noticed the wandering ascetic standing at the edge of his land with an alms bowl. The man's stillness was notable from a distance. He stood at the boundary of the field without the quality of someone waiting anxiously, and without the quality of someone performing virtue for an audience. He was simply there, fully present, in the way that very few people manage to simply be anywhere. Kasi Bharadvaja was a practical man in the middle of visible, physically demanding work. The figure at the field's edge appeared to be waiting for the results of other people's labor to arrive at his bowl without having contributed anything to that labor. He finished distributing the food, walked to the boundary of his land, and addressed the matter directly. "I plow and I sow," he said, "and then I eat. You should also plow and sow before you eat." The man looked at him without irritation. "I also plow and sow," he said, "and then I eat." Kasi Bharadvaja examined what was in front of him. No plow, no yoke, no draft animal, no plowshare, no goad, no equipment of any kind adequate to the claim being made. He was not a man who accepted implausible claims without evidence. "We see no plow," he said, "no yoke, no oxen, no plowshare. You say you plow and sow. Show me this farming of yours." The man sat down at the edge of the field. Behind Kasi Bharadvaja, the work continued, animals moving, workers following, 500 plows in the morning air. And then the man sitting at the field's boundary began to speak, in the language Kasi Bharadvaja had lived inside his entire adult life. "Faith," he said, "is the seed. The seed goes into the ground first, before any other element of the cultivation has material to work with, before the rain has anything to reach, and the plow has any prepared bed to work across." The teaching uses the word faith with precision. It means the specific willingness to begin the work before the harvest has confirmed that beginning was worth it. The provisional, reasonable trust of someone who has observed what the ground has produced for others across generations. and is willing to attempt the same cultivation in their own plot. It does not mean credulity or the suspension of practical judgment in favor of something attractive. A farmer who needs to see the harvest before committing to the planting will never plant. The season will pass with the ground unbroken and the potential unrealized. A person who needs the full results of practice before beginning the practice will continue waiting for a certainty that only the practice itself can provide. Faith is what allows the work to begin in the presence of that uncertainty, before the outcome has declared itself, while the ground still looks like it always has. Practice is the rain. It falls consistently, or the seed cannot germinate, and what has been planted cannot survive the ground's natural tendency to dry between one effort and the next. The seed is present. The intention is present. The potential is present. But potential without the conditions sustaining it produces nothing the farmer intended. In the teaching, practice means the consistent return to the work across ordinary days, not the intense effort of transformation attempted in concentrated bursts of motivation, but the patient, unglamorous return to attention morning after morning, through the weeks and months in which nothing visible is changing and no evidence of growth appears above the surface. What the rain does through those apparently empty weeks is necessary for what will eventually emerge. The cultivation happening invisibly beneath the surface during the apparently silent periods is not separate from the eventual harvest. It is the harvest being prepared. Wisdom is the plough and the ploughshare combined, the instrument that turns the ground and cuts below the surface to the depth where something can actually take root and survive conditions that will not always be favorable. Surface understanding does not produce lasting growth. An idea about a teaching, held lightly, agreed with in conversation, kept at the level of an interesting position, will not change what the mind does during a difficult Thursday morning when the habitual machinery engages and the familiar spiral begins. The plough cuts below into the compacted earth and breaks it open to the depth where roots can go and stay. Wisdom in this teaching is the capacity to perceive below the surface of experience, to the mechanisms operating beneath it, the craving underneath what feels like ordinary preference, the resistance underneath ordinary discomfort, the structure of adding beneath what appears to be simply the weight of the situation as it stands. This depth of perception is what the whole cultivation is aimed at eventually making possible. Moral care is the guiding pole. A plough driven without a guiding pole cuts in whatever direction the animal leads, and the furrow becomes uneven across the full length of the field. The ethical dimension of practice, how a person speaks, acts, and earns their living across the ordinary hours of ordinary days, provides the structural alignment that keeps everything else moving in a direction the cultivation can use. Ethics, in this understanding, is not a set of external rules governing behavior from outside. It is the recognition that actions generating harm in others generate the specific conditions that make the inner cultivation harder to pursue, and that aligning daily action with this recognition is maintenance work the field continuously requires. The guiding pole does not supply the force that drives the plough. It keeps the force moving true across the full length of the season. The mind itself is the draft animal. It provides the force that moves everything else forward through the resistance of the ground. An untrained mind moves in the direction of whatever pulls it most strongly from moment to moment, toward the available distraction, when distraction is present, toward the established groove of its habitual pattern, rather than the new furrow the farmer is attempting to cut. Training the mind is not about suppressing its energy. It is about developing, through patient and consistent effort, across genuine time, a mind that can be guided reliably in the direction the work requires. The change happens gradually, with little drama, in any individual day's practice. Its cumulative effects become visible in retrospect, when the quality of the mind's available attention is compared against what it was at the beginning of the training. Mindfulness is the plowshare that cuts, and the goad that keeps the animal moving when it slows. Without it, the plow rides over the surface without penetrating to the depth where something can grow. In practice, mindfulness means the capacity to notice what is actually present in this moment, in the body, in the quality of the mind, in the texture of what the current situation contains, without being absorbed so completely into the content of experience that awareness of the experience itself disappears inside it. A person who is aware of anger, as anger, is in a genuinely different position from the person who is simply angry, because the awareness creates a gap between the arising of the state and the response the state would otherwise automatically produce. The gap is where choice becomes available. A mind without that gap cannot choose. It can only continue in the direction the momentum of its established patterns is already carrying it. Developing mindfulness is developing the gap. The gap, once established as a reliable feature of the mind's operation, changes the texture of every difficult moment that comes after. Careful speech is the binding that holds the equipment together. A plow whose components come loose during the work causes immediate damage and requires the work to stop before it can resume. What a person says and how they say it, its honesty, its care, its attention to what the words do in the people who receive them, determines whether the relationships inside which practice is embedded hold together or generate damage that takes attention and energy away from the cultivation itself. Practice does not happen in isolation from the daily texture of a life lived among other people. The binding keeps the equipment intact enough for the work to continue through the full length of the season, through the days when conditions are favorable and the days when they are not. Right action clears the weeds. A field full of competing growth will not produce what it was cultivated for, regardless of how carefully every other element of the work has been managed. Actions generating harm to others introduce competing growth that consumes the conditions the intended crop requires. The clearing is practical maintenance, A life whose actions consistently work against the direction of the practice will produce what those actions generate rather than what the cultivation aims at, because the field is everything it contains across its whole extent. Effort drives the furrow forward across the full length of the field. The teaching describes effort as operating in 4 directions simultaneously, not creating fresh conditions for harm when the impulse arises, releasing harmful conditions when they are already present, actively cultivating beneficial conditions when the opportunity exists, and maintaining beneficial conditions once they have been established. These 4 together constitute the work of every ordinary day. They produce no visible drama in any individual practice session. They are the consistent movement of the plough across the full extent of the field, season after season, producing what consistent cultivation produces. The harvest from this cultivation, the Buddha said, is freedom from the craving that generates suffering. Kasi Bharadvaja stood at the edge of his field and heard this entire account delivered in the vocabulary of his own work. He had not been given abstract philosophy held at a comfortable distance from the texture of a practical life. He had been given an account of cultivation, the same fundamental activity he had been engaged in on this land for decades, mapped precisely onto the interior of a mind. The equipment was different. The logic was identical. Prepare the ground, plant the right things in it, tend it consistently through conditions you cannot control, and when the season is right, the field produces what it was capable of producing all along. He stood there with the smell of turned earth in the air, and 500 ploughs working behind him, and the framework was entirely legible. He filled a bronze bowl with milk rice and offered it to the Buddha. He asked to receive the teaching as a layman, a person with 500 ploughs and the full weight of a practical life, who intended to bring this cultivation into the days he was already living, in the field he already knew. Kasi Bharadvaja did not give up his field. This is worth holding directly. The path the Buddha described did not require abandoning ordinary life in favor of some more spiritually qualified version of it. It required bringing a specific quality of cultivation into the life already being lived, to the conversation that is about to go badly, to the moment when the familiar machinery wants to engage, to the quality of attention available to the work currently being done and the person currently present. The field for this cultivation already exists in every life. It exists in the texture of ordinary Tuesday mornings, in the specific moment when something goes wrong and the established spiral begins, in the daily accumulation of small choices about where attention goes and what the mind does with what it finds there. What the teaching provides is the seed, the rain, the plough, and the understanding of what the cultivation is for. The 8 areas of practice move across 3 broad territories that operate together and cannot be developed effectively in isolation from each other. The first territory covers how a person acts in the world, speech, physical action, and livelihood across ordinary hours. These 3 together determine the quality of the field in which everything else must grow. A person whose daily actions consistently generate harm to those around them is working in a field that keeps producing the specific conditions that make the inner cultivation harder. Speech that misleads, action that exploits, work that requires others to be damaged in its practice. Each introduces competing growth that consumes what the intended crop requires. The care brought to this first territory is the guiding pole, and the weeding brought into the full width of an ordinary life. It is the maintenance condition without which the rest of the cultivation cannot proceed cleanly, because what a person does with their body and voice across ordinary hours shapes the specific conditions in which the mind then attempts its own training. It comes first in the teaching structure, not as a moralistic gateway, but as the ground preparation that makes everything following it possible. The second territory covers the direct training of the mind, effort, mindfulness, and the development of sustained attention. This is the consistent rein and the sharp plowshare applied to the interior of a mind that has been running on its habitual momentum, largely unexamined, for most of its life. What this training requires in practice is less dramatic than it tends to sound when stated formally. It is the repeated return to present moment awareness across ordinary days, noticing when the mind has moved into its familiar spiral and returning before the spiral has completed its course, developing the capacity to sustain attention on what is actually present rather than on the narration the mind produces about what is present. The training accumulates through exactly this kind of consistent, unglamorous return. After months of genuine practice, the mind a person returns to is different from the one they started with, more available to what is present, less automatically driven by established patterns, more capable of the gap between stimulus and response, in which a considered response becomes an actual possibility rather than a foregone conclusion. The change is invisible from the outside in any individual day's practice. Across a season of genuine effort, it becomes unmistakable. The third territory covers how clearly experience is seen. Clear seeing here means the capacity to observe how experience is constructed moment by moment, craving arising in contact with the pleasant, aversion arising in contact with the unpleasant, the impermanence of both, the constructed nature of the self that appears to stand behind the process and manage it from a safe distance. This territory requires the first two to have developed sufficiently to provide the conditions it needs. The first territory reduces the friction that obscures clear perception. The second makes subtle mechanisms visible that the unexamined mind moves through without registering. When seeing has become clear enough to confirm the teaching at the level of direct experience, rather than intellectual agreement, something in the practice becomes self-sustaining in a way that motivated effort alone cannot produce. A person who has directly seen, even once, even briefly, that the adding is a process the mind is performing rather than a truth the situation contains, has a form of knowing that changes the entire orientation of the practice. The harvest develops progressively and is visible in ordinary life well before any complete attainment has been established. A person practicing consistently across months will notice specific changes in the texture of difficult experience. The error that previously generated extended self-recrimination is seen as an error, something that happened, with consequences that can be addressed, without becoming the occasion for an extended interior prosecution of the person's fundamental adequacy. The difficult conversation that previously occupied 2 hours of mental rehearsal afterward occupies less. The morning restlessness appears less reliably and passes more quickly when it does appear. The persistent sense that something is not quite right, which follows a person through circumstances that look entirely fine from the outside, that quality becomes less constant, less adhesive. Each of these changes is modest in itself. Their cumulative effect across a life of genuine practice is a progressive increase in how much of that life is actually lived, rather than spent managing the aftermath of what has already happened. The harvest itself is freedom from the automatic machinery that turns plain experience into elaborated suffering. Difficulty is still difficult. Loss is still loss. Impermanence continues to operate in everything that matters. What changes is how much of the mind's available attention is consumed in the aftermath of plain experience, and how much becomes available for what is actually present in the current moment. A life in which more of what is present is actually received, rather than processed at a careful distance behind a continuous narration about what it all means, is a life more fully and genuinely lived. That progressive increase in the quality of presence is the harvest that does not disappoint, because it deepens through the cultivation itself, regardless of what any particular season delivers. A wandering stranger spent years walking toward a teaching he could not have named. He had been preparing the ground without knowing that was what the walking was for. He arrived one evening at a potter's house on a road like any other road, asked if he could rest there overnight, and was told yes. Another traveler had already settled in ahead of him. They shared the space in the ordinary way that travelers share space when the night has come and the morning's next stage has not yet been determined. What passed between them before the night ended, the teaching the stranger received from the man he did not yet know, was the Buddha in that unremarkable place, under those entirely ordinary conditions, is the fifth part of what this video has been building toward. How the four truths hold together in a single understanding, why cessation is possible at all, and why ground prepared across years of walking can receive, in a potter's house on an otherwise ordinary evening, exactly what it has spent years being prepared for. Pukusati had been walking for months before he arrived at the potter's house. He came from Taxila, a city in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, known for its scholarly traditions and teachers of many kinds. He had been a merchant of standing there, a man with a life that provided everything external measurement considers adequate and a little more. The accounts in the tradition describe him receiving news of the Buddha, not through hearsay, but through a letter from a king who had encountered the teaching himself and wanted to share what he had found with someone he genuinely respected. The letter described the quality of a mind that had understood something about the nature of experience with sufficient depth that it showed in how the man moved through the world, in the quality of attention he brought to whatever was in front of him, in the specific stillness of someone who had arrived somewhere that most people never reach. Pukusati read it with care. Something in the reading landed with the weight of recognition, the quieter quality of encountering a description of what has been true for a long time and has not yet been named. He gave up his household. He took robes. He began walking south toward the middle country where the Buddha was teaching. The walking itself matters to this story. Pukusati was not traveling to a confirmed address. He had no reliable description of what the Buddha looked like, no community to guide him toward a specific monastery, no itinerary confirmed in advance. He walked toward a teaching he could not have precisely described, sustained by the specific quality of orientation that years of genuine seeking develops in a person, the readiness that recognizes what it has been looking for when conditions finally bring them together, without requiring prior confirmation that this will be what it turns out to be. A person walking towards something they can name, but not describe, has a specific quality of attention that differs from ordinary purposeful travel. There is no accumulation of certainties along the way, no evidence building toward confirmation that the destination exists. Each day's walking is undertaken with the same provisional faith as the previous days, and the only thing changing across the months is the accumulated distance. Pukusati walked with this quality through the whole span of the journey. He did not know what arrival would look like. He knew only that he was oriented in the right direction, and that continuing was what the practice required of him. This quality, ground prepared, without knowing what seed it was being prepared for, is itself part of what the teaching in the potter's house that night was about. He arrived in Rajagaha as the evening light was failing. He needed shelter. He found a potter named Bhagava and asked if he could rest under his roof. The potter said yes, and mentioned that another wandering ascetic was already settled inside. Pukusati went in, found a place on the floor, offered the other man the appropriate greeting of one practitioner to another, and settled into his own practice for the night. The other man was the Buddha. Pukusati did not know this. They shared the space in the ordinary way that two strangers share space when the night has come and there is nothing to negotiate, each contained within his own attention, each occupied with his own interior work. The potter's house was the kind of structure that working people used across that region, functional, modest, built for the work it housed rather than for the comfort of those passing through it. Outside, the sounds of a town settling towards sleep. Inside, two wandering ascetics, and the specific quality of stillness that arrives in any place once the ordinary activity of the day has concluded. There was nothing to mark the occasion, no ceremony, no preparation, nothing to indicate that what was about to happen was anything other than two strangers sharing borrowed shelter from the dark. At some point in the shared quiet, the man Pukusati did not yet know began to teach. He began with the body and with what the body is actually made of. 6 elements, he said. Earth, the quality of solidity in every solid thing the body contains. Bone and muscle and tissue shared with the solid things of the world outside the body. Water, the quality of fluidity in blood and the body's internal surfaces, shared with the fluid things of the world. Fire, the heat the body maintains and generates, shared with every warm thing in the world. Air, the quality of movement and breath, shared with every moving thing in the world. Space, the cavities and openings inside the body through which everything else moves, shared with the space of the world. And consciousness, the awareness that registers all of this, that notices the solidity and the fluidity and the heat and the movement and the space present and attending in this room on this particular night. None of these elements, he continued, is mine. The earth in this body was not produced by this body. It arrived from the earth of the world, through food, through the chain of processes by which the world continuously becomes the body, and the body continuously returns to the world again. The same is true of each element in turn. The body is a temporary convergence of elements that belong to the world, moving through a form that has borrowed them for a limited time. It is a process currently in progress, held together by conditions that will eventually cease. Holding this understanding does not diminish the body's reality. The warmth is real. The breath is real. What changes is the quality of relationship the mind takes toward what it has been treating as a permanent possession and a fixed center of experience. A person who has genuinely received this understanding approaches even ordinary physical experience differently. The warmth of a cup in the hands remains pleasant. The coolness of night air on the skin remains what it is. Nothing is diminished. But the specific compulsion to hold on to the pleasant and push away the unpleasant shifts in quality, because the thing that was being held onto and pushed from, the permanent possession that owned the experience, has been recognized as a process rather than a fixed entity. This recognition changes the ground on which everything else in the teaching then stands. Pukusati listened. He had encountered teachings about the body's impermanence before. Various traditions in the world he had grown up in addressed this in comparable ways. What was different here was the direction the account was building toward. It was not an ending point. It was preparing the ground for something more precise, an account of what the mind does with experience, moment by moment, and what that doing produces in the texture of a lived life. Contact, the teacher said. When any of the 6 elements meets a corresponding object in the world, contact occurs. The eye meets a visible form. The ear meets a sound. The body meets a texture, a temperature, a pressure. The mind meets a thought, a memory, an anticipation. Contact is simply what happens when a sense and its object meet, and it happens continuously across every waking hour, beneath the level of deliberate attention, a constant stream of small encounters that together constitute the lived experience of being a body in a world full of things it continuously meets. From contact, feeling arises. The word here means something more specific than emotion. It names the basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that accompanies every moment of contact. The hand meets the warmth of a cup of tea, and the warmth is pleasant. The same hand meets a sharp edge, and the contact is unpleasant. The eye moves across a plain wall, and the contact is neither. This quality arises automatically, prior to any decision or interpretation. It is the raw material of experience, before the mind has done anything deliberate with it. And the stream of this raw material, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, moment after moment throughout every ordinary day, is what the mind is continuously working with in ways that most people have never paused to examine. Then the teacher said the thing that Mahāsīlava had spent months walking toward without being able to name what he was walking toward. What the mind ordinarily does with this raw material is reach toward the pleasant, wanting more, away from the unpleasant, wanting it to stop or not return, past the neutral, scanning already for something more worthy of attention. This reaching, automatic, habitual, operating largely below the level of conscious awareness, is the craving identified in the second part of the teaching as the cause of suffering. What makes this account so precise is where it locates the origin of the reaching, not in dramatic ambition or obviously destructive desire, but in the most ordinary moment of experience, the fraction of a second between a feeling arising and the mind beginning its habitual movement toward or away from what the feeling contains. Consider what this means across a single morning. The alarm sounds, unpleasant contact, the mind moves toward the quiet that would make it stop. The first cup of tea, pleasant contact, the mind moves toward, extending the pleasure. A memory of yesterday's unfinished difficulty, unpleasant contact, the mind moves towards suppression or the distraction that would briefly provide relief. Each of these movements is small. Each produces a brief trace of the reaching quality in the mind. By midday, the reaching pattern has reinforced itself dozens of times. By evening, the specific, mild exhaustion that most people attribute to the demands of the day is partly the exhaustion of a mind that has been reaching all day without noticing it. The grinding quality that runs beneath ordinary experience is not produced by any single contact. It accumulates from the continuous adding of the reaching to each contact, compounding across the waking hours into the low, persistent sense that something is not quite right about the present arrangement of things. Mahāsīlava sat in complete stillness and felt the mechanism operating in the present moment as it was being described. The pleasant quality of a teaching reaching him exactly where years of preparation had arranged for it to land. The reaching toward more of it. The awareness of that reaching arising in the listening itself. The gap between the awareness and the reaching, precisely the gap the teacher was describing, present in the room in the most immediate form possible. The teaching was not pointing at something distant. It was pointing at what was happening now, in this specific quality of receiving. The teacher continued, when the craving is not automatically followed, when awareness meets the reaching before it has completed, the chain that ordinarily leads from feeling to craving to elaborated suffering does not run its full course. Contact still occurs. Feeling still arises. The pleasant remains pleasant, and the unpleasant remains unpleasant. What changes is what the mind does in the following fraction of a second. The automatic movement of craving does not follow, and what craving ordinarily adds to experience is not added. Experience can then be met directly, fully present with what is here, without the specific compulsion to make it other than what it is. This is the philosophical ground on which the whole teaching stands. Things arise when conditions are present, and cease when conditions are absent. Nothing arises randomly, and nothing persists independently of what is sustaining it. Suffering arises when craving meets feeling in the habitual way, and the chain runs its full course. When that meeting is interrupted by clear seeing, what the meeting ordinarily produces does not arise. The first part of the teaching, that suffering exists, is explained by this. Suffering is conditionally produced. The second, that craving is its cause, is explained by this. Craving is the specific link in the chain where the adding occurs. The third, that cessation is possible, is confirmed by this. A conditionally produced chain can be interrupted at the point where conditions are being added. The fourth, the path, is the cultivation of the conditions that make that interruption progressively more available across the ordinary days of an ordinary life. The 4 parts are not 4 separate teachings requiring individual acceptance. They are 4 facets of a single understanding: how suffering is built, from what it is built, where the building can be interrupted, and how consistent practice develops the capacity for that interruption across months and years of genuine effort. Pukasati sat with this through the hours of that night. At some point, in the way genuine understanding sometimes completes itself through full recognition, rather than through accumulation of further information, something shifted in him that the tradition describes precisely: the first stage of awakening, in which the mechanism has been seen clearly enough that the direction of practice cannot be reversed. A person who has directly seen how suffering is constructed cannot unsee it. The habitual patterns do not dissolve in a single night. What changes is what the patterns operate inside. A mind that now sees the reaching as reaching, rather than inhabiting the reaching from inside it without any distance, is a genuinely different mind in its relationship to experience. The craving still arises. The contacts and feelings still occur. What has changed is the gap, now consistently available in a way it was not consistently available before, between the feeling arising and the habitual movement following it. That gap was present in Pukkasati before the sky outside the potter's walls began to lighten. When there was enough light to see clearly, he asked the man across the room, "Who are you?" The man said, "I am Gautama." Pukkasati was quiet for a moment. Then he rose, approached, and expressed his respect in the form the tradition prescribed. He said he had been walking for months hoping to reach this teacher, and that the teacher had been here in a potter's house, and he had not known it until now. He asked to be received as a student, and eventually as a monk. The Buddha agreed, and told him to find a robe and a bowl, so that the ordination could proceed in the proper form. Pukkasati left the potter's house to find what he needed. On the road, he was struck by a stray cow and killed. When the Buddha was told, he named what had been established in Pukkasati before the end of that night. A genuine and irreversible shift in understanding, the first stage of awakening, the point from which the direction of practice cannot be reversed. The ordination, the robe, the formal continuation, these are the forms liberation takes in a life that goes on. Pukkasati's life did not go on. The cow was a cow on a road, moving from its own conditions, producing what it produced. The tradition makes no claim that this was deserved consequence, and no part of this teaching softens the plain fact: a man killed on a morning road after finding what he had spent months walking toward. What the tradition records clearly is the quality of what had been established before the road ended, and it records it without hesitation. The ending carries its own teaching. The third part of the teaching claims that cessation is not contingent on circumstances remaining favorable. Mahāsīlava demonstrated this in a charnel ground, his kingdom lost, and his body buried. Pukkasati demonstrates it at the most irreducible level. What was established in him in the potter's house did not depend on what the road chose to do the following morning. The interior shift was established through its own conditions and was not undone by external ones. Liberation, in this teaching, is a quality of relationship to experience that circumstances can no longer reliably disturb, and a stray cow on a morning road is not a counterexample. Every section of this video has shown one face of what Pukkasati received in the potter's house. Vasithi's wandering showed where suffering lives when a life's organizing center is suddenly gone, the mind continuing the movement the life had trained it for, searching the space where the presence used to be. Magandia's anger showed how craving protects itself from recognition, the resistance the mechanism generates when the teaching gets close enough to disturb what the mechanism depends on. Mahāsīlava in the charnel ground showed what becomes available when the adding stops, experience met without the mind's compulsion to make it other than it is, even in conditions where that compulsion would seem inevitable. Kasi Bharadvaja's field showed the cultivation through which this capacity develops, in ordinary language and through the logic of ordinary work. And Pukkasati's night showed all four held together, how suffering is constructed from the raw material of contact and feeling and habitual reaching, how the chain can be interrupted at the point where awareness meets the adding before the adding has completed, and why the preparation a person brings to the moment of genuine teaching determines what that teaching can produce when conditions finally bring it home. The teaching has one more movement, and it is the one most immediately applicable to a life lived in its ordinary form. A woman named Damadina sat with her former husband and answered every question he brought her about the 4 parts of the teaching. Each answer was precise, technically complete, and confirmed by the Buddha without a single revision. What she demonstrated was something the potter's house and the charnel ground and the field could only approach, that the teaching does not require extraordinary circumstances, dramatic encounters, or months of walking towards something that cannot yet be named. It lives in an ordinary conversation between 2 people who know each other well, in the specific texture of a familiar exchange, going exactly as deep as complete understanding goes, which turns out, as the next section will show, to be very deep indeed. Visakha and Damadina had been married in Rajagaha for years when something changed in her. The texts do not describe the process of that change in detail. What they record is the outcome. She came to Visakha one day and asked to be released from the marriage so that she could ordain and practice the teaching in the form her understanding now required. She had been a laywoman of standing in a prosperous household, living the full texture of a domestic life with all that such a life contains: the management of a home, the relationships with family and community, the specific daily rhythms of a life organized around shared responsibilities, and the ordinary human work of building something durable with another person across years. She was not leaving because the life was difficult or because the relationship had failed. Something had shifted in her understanding, and the shift required a different form of attention to be followed with the full seriousness it deserved. This kind of departure is among the most difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced the specific quality of understanding that makes it feel not like a choice but like a recognition. A person who has understood something deeply enough that the current form of their life can no longer fully contain what the understanding requires tends to find the departure not dramatic but simply accurate. The natural movement of a life that has grown in a direction the current container was not built for. Damadina was not unhappy with Visakha. She was clear about what she needed, and the clarity had the quality of something that had been building toward expression for long enough that when it finally expressed itself, it felt complete and inevitable, rather than impulsive. Visakha listened. He gave her what she asked for with the specific quality of respect a person extends when they recognize something genuine in another person, even when that genuine thing is moving in a direction they cannot yet follow themselves. There are moments in close relationships when one person's clarity about what they need becomes a kind of gift to the person receiving it, even when what they are being given is the other person's departure. What Visakha was given was the sight of someone choosing a path with complete sincerity, the specific quality of commitment in her that would not bend toward convenience or the comfort of what was already built and familiar. He could recognize that quality even without fully understanding where it came from. He gave her what she asked for. The generosity of that giving was its own form of understanding, even if he could not yet have named what he was understanding. She left and practiced with the full commitment of someone who has set down the actual daily texture of a comfortable life, not comfort as an idea. She did not practice at the edge of her life while maintaining the rest of it intact. She had reorganized entirely around the practice, which is what the ordination meant in practice rather than in ceremony. The tradition records that her understanding developed with notable speed. The language it uses suggests a mind that had been prepared in ways that became available once the conditions for full practice were present. The years in the household had done something in her that she had not been doing deliberately. Living carefully, attending honestly to the texture of experience across the ordinary difficulties and satisfactions of a domestic life, working through what the life provided without either avoiding it or exaggerating it. These had cultivated ground that the practice could then work with directly. Preparation that does not look like preparation from inside it is still preparation. The ground was ready, and practice in those conditions moved quickly because the ground had been quietly prepared for a long time before the formal cultivation began. Visakha, back in Rajagaha, continued his own practice after her departure. He had always been a serious person, and her leaving gave his seriousness a direction it had not previously had. Witnessing a genuine transformation in someone close sometimes opens a door in a person that remained closed, while that person was present, as though the specific quality of their change makes visible a possibility that had previously been abstract. He began studying and practicing in earnest. His questions grew alongside his practice, and there came a time when the questions had matured past what he could resolve through his own effort alone. He needed to bring them to someone who could answer them from the inside of genuine understanding. He went to find Damodinar. She had returned to the vicinity of Rajagaha and was living there. The meeting was arranged with the formality appropriate to a conversation between a layman seeking instruction and a monastic capable of offering it. The specific formality of the occasion bracketed the history of who they had been to each other, not erasing it, but setting it aside in the way that any genuine conversation sets aside whatever is not relevant to the quality of the exchange taking place. He asked for permission to question her. She said, "Ask whatever you wish, and whatever I understand, I will explain." The simplicity of her offer was itself an indication. She was not offering to share information she had learned, but to describe what she could directly see. Visakha asked his first question: "What is identity?" Damodinar's answer was immediate and specific. "Identity," she said, "is the 5 ways we cling to experience. We cling to the body, treating it as a fixed possession that belongs to a stable self, and is that self's most immediate territory. We cling to feeling, the stream of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations that arises through contact with the world, treating them as things that happen to a person who stands behind them as their permanent owner and manager. We cling to perception, to the organizing categories through which raw sensory input is sorted into recognizable objects, situations, and meanings. We cling to mental formations, the habitual patterns of thought, intention, reaction, and emotional response that have been running through the mind across the years of a life until they feel like character rather than conditioning. And we cling to consciousness itself, the knowing quality that registers all the others, treating it as the most fundamental and permanent of all. Identity is the sum of this clinging, the process of grasping applied continuously to these 5 elements of experience, constructing through that application the sense of a continuous self who stands behind them and manages them from a stable center. What is the origin of identity? The craving, she said, that reaches toward the pleasant, toward the continuation of what is currently good, away from what is unpleasant, and toward its cessation. The grasping applies itself to the 5 elements and produces, through that application, the felt sense of a self who owns them. The self appears to be the one doing the wanting. The wanting is what is producing the self. This reversal is among the most counterintuitive movements in the entire teaching, and also among the most liberating once it has been directly seen. The self who appears to be doing the craving is itself a product of the craving, constructed and continuously reconstructed by the activity of grasping applied to the elements of experience as they arise. There is no fixed entity at the center doing the grasping. There is the grasping, and the sense of a center is what the grasping generates. Understanding this does not immediately dissolve the sense of center. It changes the relationship to it, from taking it as a given to recognizing it as a process that can be observed, and a process that can be observed is a process that can be worked with. What is the cessation of identity? The complete fading and cessation of that craving, its abandonment, its relinquishment, its release, she said. When the craving ceases, the identity the craving was constructing ceases with it. What remains is experience continuing, contact, feeling, consciousness, awareness of the present moment, without the compulsive adding of grasping that had been turning each moment of experience into raw material for the construction of a permanent self. The world is still here. Other people are still here. Sensation continues. The difference is in the quality of what meets all of this. The specific compulsion to make each moment serve the ongoing project of being a particular self with particular needs is no longer operating. Experience met without that compulsion carries a quality the tradition describes as bliss, not a pleasant feeling layered over experience, but the quality of a mind that has set something very heavy down and found the setting down to be its own form of relief. What is the path to that cessation? The Noble Eightfold Path, she said. The 8 areas of practice whose logic Kasi Bharadvaja had recognized in the language of his field: careful speech, ethical action, right livelihood, trained effort, developed mindfulness, concentrated attention, and the clear seeing that develops when all these have been cultivated with genuine consistency over genuine time. The path leads toward the quality of experience present before the craving organized itself around the construction of a defended self. In brief moments of genuine practice, it makes that quality available along the way before any complete attainment has been established, as something the practitioner can recognize from inside their own experience, rather than simply know about from a description. The 4 questions had traced the full arc of the teaching precisely, from what suffering is, to what generates it, to what its cessation means, to how to cultivate the conditions for that cessation. Visakha had received 4 answers that together constituted, without abstraction, a complete account of what was happening in the texture of any ordinary day. Then he asked the question that took the conversation into its deepest territory. Are feelings the same as identity? Or are feelings one thing and identity another? This question appears to be a philosophical clarification, but is actually asking about the precise mechanics of how suffering is generated in the smallest possible unit of experience, the fraction of a second between a feeling arising and what the mind does with it. Feelings are neither identical to identity, Dhammadinna said, nor simply separate from it. The relationship is more specific than either framing captures. Feelings arise in the body through contact. When any sense meets its corresponding object, a feeling arises carrying the basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. This feeling is, in itself, simply what it is, an event in experience, arising from specific conditions, passing when those conditions shift. It constructs nothing on its own. It does not produce a self or generate suffering simply by arising and passing. What produces identity from feelings is what the mind does in the moment after they arise, the automatic movement of craving toward the pleasant and away from the unpleasant, the organized activity of grasping meeting each feeling as it arrives and treating it as raw material for the ongoing construction of a self who owns the feelings and must manage their implications. Identity is built and reinforced in that meeting, in the fraction of a second between the feeling arising and the habitual reaching following it. Each time this occurs, the construction is reinforced, the sense of a continuous self who has had pleasant experiences and unpleasant experiences and is navigating the stream of them towards something better is generated again, made a little more solid, given a little more history to stand on. Across the thousands of such moments that constitute an ordinary waking day, this process of construction runs so consistently and so automatically that the self it produces feels entirely real, entirely stable, and entirely the kind of thing that manages feelings rather than being produced by them. Consider what this looks like in any ordinary morning. An unpleasant thought arises before the day has properly begun, a trace of yesterday's difficulty, a worry about something ahead, a brief image of something said or left unsaid. The feeling is unpleasant. This is simply what has arisen, a neutral description of a specific quality present in this moment of experience. What ordinarily follows, in the fraction of a second after the feeling arrives, is the activity of a self managing it, interpreting the feeling, relating it to other memories and anticipated futures, building from it a narrative about the person who is having it and what the feeling reveals about that person's situation in the world. The narrative generates its own feelings. Those feelings generate further interpretation. The original thought, which lasted a fraction of a second, has become the seed of something occupying the next 20 minutes, an elaborate internal structure built from a single moment of contact, which would not have grown into that structure if the grasping had not immediately met the feeling and begun its work. What Dhammadina is pointing at is the specific step where this amplification begins, the fraction of a second gap between the feeling arising and the reaching following it. That gap is where the practice lives in its most immediate form, because that gap is where the choice between following the habitual reaching and not following it is actually available. A mind that sees the reaching as reaching in that moment, that has developed enough clarity to notice the movement before it has completed, is in a genuinely different relationship to experience from a mind moving through the same sequence without any space between the feeling arising and the full habitual response being engaged. The difference in any individual moment is small. Across months and years of genuine practice, the accumulated difference is what the cultivation of the Eightfold Path actually produces. The restlessness becomes less adhesive. The spiral after an unpleasant feeling runs a shorter course. The pleasant moment is received more fully because the mind is less occupied with the specific work of holding on to it. These changes are not dramatic in any single practice session. They are the harvest Kasi Bharadvaja understood when the Buddha described what the cultivation was for. Visakha took everything she had said and went directly to the Buddha. He reported the conversation in full and asked whether Dhammadina had answered correctly. The Buddha's response is recorded in the text with quiet completeness. "She has answered correctly," he said. "If you had asked me the same questions, I would have given you the same answers." Dhammadina is wise. She has the capacity to teach the teaching. There is nothing qualified about this confirmation. No asterisk, no modification, no single answer revised or softened. A woman who had been a married laywoman in a Rajagaha household, who had practiced seriously since her ordination, who brought no formal rank or institutional seniority, who had simply brought genuine attention to genuine practice over genuine time, had described the full depth of the Four Noble Truths, down to their most subtle implications, with complete accuracy. The Buddha confirmed her capacity to teach them to others, without qualification, without suggesting that formal training or institutional standing would have produced a more reliable account. Understanding lives wherever the conditions for it have been genuinely met, and the conditions have nothing to do with rank. This confirmation carries something specific for anyone who has listened this far. The teaching does not live in specialized roles or particular lineages, or the formal institutions that have carried it across the centuries. It lives in genuine understanding, and genuine understanding develops wherever genuine practice has met the actual texture of experience over real time. Dhammadina practiced in the conditions she had. She brought the full quality of her available attention to what the practice asked of her across the years between her ordination and this conversation. What she demonstrated when Visakha came with his questions was the outcome of that work, understanding absorbed so completely into perception that it expressed itself without effort, the way a person with unimpeded sight describes what is simply visible from where they stand. The conversation happened on an ordinary day, in ordinary proximity, between two people who had known each other for years. The depth it reached was not produced by unusual conditions or specially configured circumstances. It was produced by genuine practice, meeting genuine questions in a space where both were taken with full seriousness. That space is available in any morning, in any conversation, in any life that has been bringing genuine attention to what the practice asks. The setting does not need to be formal. The questions do not need to be prepared in advance. The practice simply needs to have been met with the same quality of commitment Dhammadina brought to it from the morning she left the household and reorganized entirely around what the understanding required. The mechanism she described operates right now in the experience of anyone listening. Contact is occurring continuously, the body in contact with the temperature of the room, with the surface it is resting on, with the sounds present in whatever space this listening is happening in. Feelings are arising from each of those contacts, each carrying its basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, each lasting a fraction of a second before the next arrives. The habitual reaching is meeting each of them in the way it has met them across years, moving toward the pleasant, away from the unpleasant, past the neutral, in search of something with more content. The gap between the feeling arising and the reaching following it is present in this breath. Practice develops the consistent availability of the awareness that can see that gap before the reaching has completed, not in extraordinary conditions, not in formally configured practice settings only, but in this ordinary hour, in whatever circumstances this listening is embedded in. All 6 sections of this video have been describing the same mechanism from different angles. Vasithi's wandering showed what happens when the organizing center of a life is suddenly gone and the reaching continues without anything to reach. Margandia's anger showed how craving protects itself from recognition in a person who loved genuinely, but could not see the grasping woven through the love. Mahāsīlava in the charnel ground showed what the mind is capable of when the second layer, the adding to what is already present, is not operating. Kasi Bharadvaja's field showed the path as cultivation rather than attainment, accessible from exactly where a person currently stands. Pukusati's night in the potter's house showed how months of preparation and a single night of genuine teaching together produce what neither could produce alone. And Dhammadina sat with her former husband and described the mechanism itself, the specific meeting between feeling and grasping that generates the sense of a self-managing experience. the gap in which that generation can be interrupted, and the quality of what remains when the interruption becomes consistent enough to constitute genuine liberation. The teaching the Buddha organized into 4 parts on the night he first taught it has been in the world for 2,500 years. It met Vasitthi on a road. It met a practical farmer standing in his field. It met a wandering stranger on a potter's floor. It is available in the same form in any ordinary morning, in the specific texture of the present moment, in the gap between this feeling and what the mind is about to do with it. That gap is where everything the teaching has described lives in its most immediate and practical form. It is available right now, in this breath, in this moment, in the specific conditions of this particular life, exactly as it currently stands. The conditions are these conditions. The practice begins here. The opening of this video asked one question: what did the Buddha say about why life hurts? 6 people carried that question through their lives before it was named directly. Vasitthi wandered the roads near Mithila, carrying it in her hands and her arms, and the specific absence where children used to be. Magandia carried it as anger, which is one of the forms it takes when the mechanism is operating too close to the center of a life to be seen clearly. Mahāsīlava carried it buried to his neck in a charnel ground and found something in himself that the darkness and the jackals and the loss of an entire kingdom could not reach. Kasi Bharadvaja carried it in his field and recognized it the moment it was given back to him in the language he had worked in his whole life. Pukusati carried it for months on a road heading south and found it on an ordinary floor on an otherwise ordinary night. Dhammadinna carried it into the gap between a feeling arising and the reaching following it, and described what she found there with a precision the Buddha confirmed without a single revision. The answer has 4 parts. Suffering is real. It arises from craving. Craving can cease. There is a path. The path runs through the texture of exactly the life you are already living. It begins in the next moment you notice the reaching before it has completed. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever form of the wheels grinding is present in your life right now, that moment is closer than it has ever been.